In our lead story today, we travel to the heart of Moscow, where the murky details of some exceptionally important Kremlin intrigue have spilled out into open view. On Sunday the 12th of May, the Kremlin announced that Russian President Vladimir Putin had chosen a new defense minister for his nation, a 65-year-old economist and former deputy prime minister named Andrei Belozov. With Belozov's appointment ended the long tenure of one Sergei Shoigu, who was, at least until his ouster, a close Putin friend, an ally. The change comes at a critical moment for the Russian war machine, as frontline successes in Ukraine's east risk being stymied by a flood of new American munitions, and the entire Russian bear shifts its posture in advance of the long war to come. For anybody around the world who's watched Russia's years-long invasion in Ukraine with any level of interest, the name Sergei Shoigu has been long unmissable. As defense minister, he oversaw Russia's nearly decade-long escapades in the Donbass region of Ukraine even before the full-scale invasion of 2022. He proved to have Putin's loyalty even after having thoroughly bungled the first stage of an invasion that was once expected to take just a few weeks at the very most. And he came out the better in a year-long spat with Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of Russia's infamous paramilitary army, the Wagner Group, eventually surviving a failed mutiny by Wagner that may have been aimed directly at Shoigu's own head. But now, with Russia finally taking the initiative on the front lines and giving itself a bit of breathing room, this is the moment when Putin has decided to show Shoigu the door. Before we get into the figure who will replace Shoigu, it's worth taking a moment to explore what may happen to him next. Rather than being fired outright, Shoigu has been shifted into a leadership position in Russia's Security Council, a highly influential body where Shoigu will help to direct and organize Russia's military-industrial complex. That position was previously held by another Putin ally, Nikolai Patrushev, who will himself be shifted into another position where he will oversee the Russian shipbuilding industry. These sideways shifts reflect a policy Putin's become known for in his many years at Russia's helm, preferring to remove top officials from their posts, but allowing them to save face and keeping them ingratiated with the regime instead of giving them reason to foment turmoil against it. But that being said, Shoigu's transition in particular is certainly not a promotion in a technical sense, and it doesn't appear intended as a change to honor or reward Shoigu in a spiritual sense. Per one Russian analyst, Tatiana Stanovaya, this is the sort of appointment given to formerly influential political figures who, quote, have nowhere to settle but cannot be thrown out. In fact, the timing around Putin's decision suggests that the termination of Shoigu may have been on his mind for some time, but the inherent risk to handing over the reins of Russia's war machine when Russia was in such a tenuous position over the past 2 years may not have been worth the potential reward. Now Russia's frontline successes may actually have given Putin some breathing room to boot Shoigu out without risking disorganization during a transition period or a major morale dip on the front lines. As for why, the answer may come down to corruption. A prominent Shoigu ally, Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov, was recently brought down by a bribery case in which he took about 1 billion rubles in kickbacks. Prior to being indicted, Ivanov was known to have such broad financial access that he was referred to as, quote, Shoigu's wallet, and Shoigu himself has been accused of corruption from a variety of sources over time. The fact that Shoigu oversaw an estimated over 300,000 Russian combat casualties in Ukraine, well, that probably hasn't helped either. But as interesting as it may be to speculate on just why Shoigu got the boot, the far more important element to focus on is the man that's going to replace him. Meet Andrei Belozov, 65 years old, a lifelong Muscovite and an honors graduate of Russia's prestigious Moscow State University. An economist by trade, Belozov has no military background to speak of. According to publicly available information on him, he's never led a unit into battle, he's never flown a fighter jet or driven a tank, and he's never even gone to basic training. Instead, he spent 15 years as an economic forecaster in the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was an outside advisor to the Kremlin for a few years, he was a civil servant and a financial director for the Prime Minister, and starting in 2013, he spent about 8 years as Putin's economic assistant. During those years, he was the only Russian high-level economic advisor to support the idea of Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, and at the end of that decade, he was rewarded with an appointment as first deputy prime minister of Russia. He served there until the 12th of May this year, when his new position as defense minister was announced. By all accounts, he's someone with Putin's trust and who's seen as an ideological backer for the Russian president, but he's not typically regarded as a defense guy inside Russia. Belozov is not a guy who was on the shortlist for most Western analysts when it came to who might replace Shoigu in the future. In fact, the prevailing wisdom prior to this past week has been that if Shoigu's many blunders thus far hadn't seen him ousted, well, perhaps nothing would. But as much as Belozov's appointment comes as a surprise to the West, it's also one of those occasional shakeups where, once it's done and we can look back in hindsight, it seems as if it should have been obvious all along. Unconventional as the pick may have been, Belazov's background and his areas of expertise reflect a much broader shift in Russia's strategic thinking over the last few months, where there's good logic behind the idea that wartime experience might actually be less important than economic prowess. In order to understand why, we've got to take a look at what the Russian war machine does best: a policy of grinding, costly attritional warfare, where it wins battles not by tactical brilliance but by sheer force. Where other countries might, say, take a city with a combination of elite shock troops, close air support, and an infantry rear guard, Russia will approach the same challenge from a different angle. Bring in obscene amounts of heavy artillery and aerial bombing, level the entire city to the ground, and move troops onto the rubble to claim it long after anything resembling civilization has just been wiped off the map. It is a brutal strategic approach, one that's contributed in very real ways to the perception of Russia as particularly bloodthirsty or amenable to killing civilians and committing war crimes. Yet while those criticisms are absolutely fair, it's also important to understand the utilitarian side of the coin. Russia's tactics are highly costly in terms of both munition and, at times, manpower. But the way to stop Russia is also costly. Faced with such an attack, adversary forces can either pull back and sacrifice their territory, hunker down and probably get shelled to bits, or expend a similar amount of resources trying to prevent Russia from attacking critical positions. That last option is what Ukraine has spent the last 2 years doing, relying on shells and drones to keep Russia's grinding artillery at bay, relying on experienced combat troops to deal with wave after wave of poorly trained Russian conscripts, and trying to hold out when Russian air power or more experienced troops arrive to work toward a breakthrough. The reason why this approach makes sense for Russia is that fundamentally, the war that Russia draws its enemies into is a war that treats the front lines as a place to basically expend munitions and lives. The real battle is in how many munitions and lives can be brought up to those front lines, and between Russia's population, the 9th largest in the world, and its immense economic capacity to manufacture relatively basic equipment like bombs and artillery shells, that's a battle where Russia almost always has a massive advantage. That's a dynamic playing out on Ukraine's front lines as we speak, where, after years trying their level best, Ukraine's military-industrial complex has simply been unable to keep up. In many parts of the front line, Ukrainian troops are outnumbered anywhere from 5 to 10 against 1, while their disadvantage in artillery shell numbers is just as bad. This is why American and European military aid has been so vital in the last few months, in order to stop the bleeding for Ukraine by making up for production demands that Ukraine just can't match. At the start of the Ukraine war, back when Sergei Shoigu was among the most feared military strategists on the Eurasian supercontinent, this wasn't the kind of war that Russia expected to find itself in. This was supposed to be a quick war, even a relatively bloodless one, where an overwhelming crush of Russian troops attacked from all sides and made it to Kyiv in a matter of days. Back in those days, Russia wasn't producing nearly as much artillery. According to Shoigu himself, shell production rose by 250% from 2023 to 2024, while artillery component production rose by 2,200%. And those two were marked improvements on what Russia had been doing before the war. Back then, Russia was focused on touting advanced weapons that have turned out to be mostly vaporware. Things like the purported 5th-generation fighter aircraft, the Su-57 Furlan and Su-75 Checkmate, the T-14 Armata supertanks, the Igorek bipedal combat walker, and the Storm nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. But once Russia found itself entrenched in a long war, it fell back to the attritional strategy it's always done best, and the results have showed. First in repelling an intended Ukrainian offensive in the summer of 2023, and then in turning the tide in the Ukrainian east. And it's here where having an economist in charge of Russia's war machine makes all the sense in the world. If Russia has chosen to lean into the approach that serves it best, then it's chosen a path by which its future conflicts will be settled in wars of manufacturing and weapons production, where rates of weapon expenditure at the front lines is mostly about deciding which nation's economy buckles first. Russia is already in the middle of an economic restructuring, as Western sanctions have forced it to rethink the way that it does business, but not managed to slow it down. In fact, the Russian economy is expected to grow by 3.2% this year, according to the International Monetary Fund, outpacing the US, the UK, France, Germany, and every other advanced economy around the world. But with Russia's critical industries now becoming more self-sufficient, the nation has begun a broader turn toward an economic wartime posture that's expected to be, at the very least, semi-permanent. Russia is spending massive amounts on its military, repurposing factories and building ties with other nations abandoned or overlooked by the West, for whom the idea of Russian-exported munitions are still attractive. And rather than waxing on about wonder weapons, this economic restructuring appears as if it will prioritize exactly what's been working in Ukraine, the bare-bones stuff Russia can expend in incredible volume during wartime and find reliable customers for in peacetime. With that sort of long-term approach, Belousov's appointment is a calculated maneuver, one that's quite clearly intended to commit Russia to this course for the foreseeable future. While the day-to-day minutiae of the battlefields of Ukraine may not be details that Belousov is equipped to manage, Russia has a variety of experienced military leaders who can handle that sort of thing, and who might get a somewhat longer leash without Shoigu micromanaging from time to time. They'll still be managed by Shoigu's former deputy and Russia's top general, Valery Gerasimov, who managed to keep his post. In all likelihood, Belousov will be a bigger picture guy, focused on ensuring that Russian troops on the front have the shells, drones, tanks, and other equipment necessary to keep them on the winning side of the war. In fact, this is much more in line with the traditional role of Russian defense minister than Shoigu appeared to be in his later years, less a battlefield commander or grand strategist, and more a liaison between the Kremlin, the military, and the Russian economy. In that role, Belousov seems quite likely to thrive as an adept technocrat with a more pragmatic and utilitarian approach to the methodology behind Russia's war. He's produced tangible results in the past for Russia, squeezing the ruble equivalent of an unexpected $3 billion out of Russian corporations in 2023 in order to help finance the war effort, and managing a drone procurement program that's been among the highlights of Russia's war effort. In terms of Kremlin politics, he's an utterly non-threatening choice, with not much of a power base and seemingly even less political will to oppose Putin, and in fact, he seems to be disinterested in the idea of engaging in palace intrigue at all. By all outward indicators, he's a guy who just likes doing economic work and happens to be pretty damn good at it in a way that Putin can leverage towards his broader goals. In the short term, Belousov is likely to oversee changes inside the Russian MOD intended to move it away from the culture of corruption that it's been saddled with for years. Vladimir Putin appears more than willing to pitch in, making news one day after Belousov's appointment when another senior defense official was arrested on charges of bribery. The man in question, Lieutenant General Yuri Kuznetsov, had his home broken into via a raid by Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, and even his wife was interrogated. Kuznetsov's detention suggests a wider-reaching purge may be on the near horizon, with Belousov likely to have some latitude from Putin when it comes to identifying and kicking out leaders who he assesses not to be on the level. In the long term, Belousov is expected to play a leading role in modernizing the Russian military and moving it past both the Soviet-era thinking and the Soviet-era equipment that have defined it since 1991. He'll oversee a shift in Russia's military export policy, perhaps even undoing the current status quo where Russia is willing to accept munitions from even North Korea in order to keep its heavy guns firing on the front lines. And more likely than not, Belousov will oversee the military buildup inside Russia that is expected to happen after Ukraine, where several NATO nations now expect that Russia will attempt to test the alliance militarily within this decade. If that happens, it'll be Belousov at the helm of an economy that far eclipses NATO's current capacity to produce warfighting equipment, and if Belousov can keep Russia on the right side of the munitions gap or even widen it, then there's no telling what Russia and NATO's eventual showdown might look like. For a country of just 3.7 million, they counted among the biggest protests in modern history. Last weekend, over 50,000 people took to the streets of Tbilisi, joining tens of thousands more who'd been campaigning against the new law for weeks. In the following days, their numbers swelled until parts of the capital were completely paralyzed, lost beneath a sea of Georgian and EU flags. By Tuesday, there were even foreign dignitaries taking part. The foreign ministers of Lithuania, Estonia, and Iceland were all photographed walking with the marchers. Separately, Latvia's former minister, also visiting the city but not joining the protests, made supportive remarks. The source of all this drama was the third and final reading in Parliament of a controversial new piece of legislation known either as the Foreign Agents Law or the Russia Law, depending on who's doing the talking. Now, we'll circle back to what exactly this bill is in a few minutes, but for now, we want to emphasize just how big a deal these demonstrations really were. According to national security-focused outlet Cypher Brief, the sheer numbers of people on the streets made these, quote, one of the largest demonstrations Georgia has seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were likely also some of the most chaotic. AP News reports that there were scuffles with riot police. On different nights, water cannons, rubber bullets, and tear gas were used to disperse the crowds. And not that worked particularly well. BBC journalist Ewan MacDonald highlighted a video doing the rounds on social media that showed riot police failing to arrest a demonstrator whom the crowd pulled back to safety. As MacDonald explained, this brief video is more significant than it looks. When civilian protesters can prevent the detention of one of their own by the police using force of numbers, they have achieved parity of unarmed force with the regime. In other words, crazy stuff is going down in Georgia right now. Crazy enough that we're covering these protests on the Situation Room for the second week in a row. But while last week's edition focused on Russia's reaction to the demonstrations, this week we want to look at a different angle, an angle that many, both within Georgia and without, are openly wondering about. With mass protests like these, could Georgia be on its way towards a revolution? Now, this idea isn't as fanciful as it might sound. It's only slightly over 20 years since Georgia shook off the last of its Soviet-era leaders in a mass uprising known as the Rose Revolution. And the current crop of demonstrators are all too aware of this heritage. Speaking to the Wilson Center, former Georgian Minister of Defense Tinatin Kitashvili noted proudly how, quote, all the Georgians on the streets are talking about the Rose Revolution. One of the so-called color revolutions that swept parts of the former USSR in the 2000s, the Rose Revolution, is famous for forcing a non-violent transfer of power. As Kitashvili explains, nobody died during the Rose Revolution. Which may be why it's not modern Georgia's own historical revolution that the current government under Georgian Dream Party is talking about. Instead, they prefer a much more loaded comparison, Ukraine's 2014 Maidan Revolt. To be fair to Georgian Dream, there are enough similarities that others have remarked on it too. On X, Ewan MacDonald wrote of the protest that, quoting, I saw the same spirit on Ukraine's Maidan. Like in Ukraine, a decade ago, the trigger for these protests has been the passing of a new law that seems to drag Georgia away from Europe and towards Russia's suffocating embrace. Like in Ukraine, the protests have mostly been fueled by young people who were born long after the Soviet Union collapsed and see their nation's future in institutions like the EU and NATO. And just like in Ukraine in 2014, the government has responded with increasing violence. Foreign Policy reports that civil society activists and journalists have been targeted for harassment, ranging from menacing phone calls to being attacked by masked assailants outside their homes. Others have had posters of their faces plastered to walls declaring them enemies of the country. Meanwhile, gangs of men dressed in black have also been filmed surrounding and assaulting protesters. This is extremely similar to what happened in the early days of the Maidan, when President Viktor Yanukovych paid thugs to rough up student demonstrators. But while there are echoes of Maidan, there's still one important difference. So far, the violence hasn't been deadly. This is in stark contrast to the events in Ukraine in 2014, where the killing of 2 protesters in January triggered escalating violence that culminated in police snipers massacring demonstrators, the final trigger for the overthrow of Yanukovych's regime. Right now, Georgia seems to be a long way off from anything like that. The former defense minister, Kitashvili, thinks the government's repeated invocation of Maidan is intended to be a warning, a veiled threat that if the crowds do not back down, there could be bloodshed. Given the stakes are so high then, it's probably time we turned our attention to an obvious question. What is it about this new law that has sent people out into the streets? In its most basic form, the law sounds pretty innocuous. Modeled on a previous bill introduced in the spring of 2023 and quickly withdrawn in the face of mass protests, the law requires all NGOs and media organizations that get more than 20% of their funding from outside Georgia to register as organizations that carry out the interests of a foreign power, with enormous fines if they fail to do so. The brainchild of Georgian Dream's founder, the billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, the Foreign Agents Law is widely understood to be his pet project, even though he holds no official position in government. And this is where things start to get a little bit screwy. An old-school oligarch, Ivanishvili made his money in Moscow and still has close ties to the Russian elite. Indeed, the Georgian law seems to be directly modeled on a similar law Vladimir Putin introduced in 2012. The cipher brief explains why this is worrying, quoting again, Putin started exactly with the same premise of transparency, and then he basically closed down and arrested and killed most of the free media, NGOs, anybody who was democratic in Russia. So that's the concern in Georgia now. While the idea of Georgia going full-blown autocratic murder state may be a bit far-fetched, many people worry the law will be used to stifle free speech and close down any media that doesn't support the government, a serious worry with elections due this autumn. Now, the counter-argument might be that only independent media funded from outside Georgia will be affected. So why worry? But this severely misunderstands the nation's media landscape. Reporters Without Borders points out that Georgian advertising laws mean only state-owned outlets can make enough money to sustain themselves. All non-governmental outlets are therefore dependent on outside funding to survive. The new law, of course, won't shut them down if they register. But many worry this is just the thin end of the wedge. In Russia, the innocuous-sounding 2012 law was eventually expanded and used to drive all independent media, for example TV Rain or Echo of Moscow, out of the country. Still, there are probably limits on how much even politically attuned protesters care about media independence. What's made these demonstrations so big isn't so much the law itself, but the fear that this is the beginning of a long march back to the glory days of the USSR. Back in December, Georgia was offered candidate status by the European Union, a small but vital step towards one day joining the bloc. Gaining candidate status is something the country has officially been trying to do for years. Since a 2018 amendment, Article 78 of the Constitution directs the government to make all efforts to ensure Tbilisi joins the EU. This is something that has had massive public support. Polling by the National Democratic Institute in December showed that 79% of Georgians want to be a part of the EU. Other polls put the number as high as 90%. Even Georgian Dream claims to want to join the bloc, running in the last elections on a pro-EU ticket. Yet their current actions risk derailing Tbilisi's candidacy. On the 15th of May, the Financial Times splashed with an anonymous briefing from EU officials that the bloc would freeze Georgia's candidacy if the Foreign Agents Bill becomes law. As a result, many Georgians now believe that Georgian Dream is deliberately sabotaging the nation's chances. Instead, they worry that Ivanishvili wants to throw in his lot with Moscow, turning Georgia into a pliant neighbor in the mold of Belarus. And that's anathema to most Georgians. Since the short but bloody war in 2008, Moscow has occupied roughly 20% of Georgia's territory. This has, naturally, made the Kremlin pretty unpopular, an unpopularity that has only grown since Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine and tens of thousands of Russians fled to Georgia to escape mobilization. Today, both Russia the state and Russians themselves are deeply unpopular in much of Georgia. So a law that seems to bring Tbilisi closer into Moscow's orbit would naturally go down as smoothly as a bucket of cold sick. It also doesn't help that Georgian Dream has rammed the new law through with little scrutiny. During the second hearing, 7 opposition members were expelled from the room while the government rushed the bill through a legal committee in an eye-watering 1 minute and 7 seconds. While President Salome Zhorapashvili has already said she'll veto the legislation, the government has the numbers to override her veto. Although the exact timeline is murky, that means the law should soon come into effect. At that point, it'll be interesting to see what happens, if the great mass of protesters eventually fades away, or whether the people talking about another Rose Revolution or another Maidan turn out to be right. Speaking to Cypher Brief, CIA veteran Ralph Goff remarked, quote, "A scenario involving a bloody popular uprising is not out of the question." In the same article, chairman of Ukrainian-American House, Roman Sheremetyev, predicted that, quote, "Knowing Georgian people, having friends from Georgia, knowing where they stand, I don't think they will allow this government to continue. I honestly think there will be riots and protests and a pretty brutal confrontation between police and Georgian people." End quote. For what it's worth, he's not alone. While things haven't yet gone truly sideways, there's a feeling in the air where Tbilisi is concerned. A feeling that neither side is going to back down, and things could get very dangerous from here on out. It could be that this storm of protest passes, but it could also be that we're now witnessing the first weeks of Georgia's second revolution in 2 decades. If things do finally boil over, it could yet turn out to be one of the most significant stories of the year. And next up today, we are turning our attention back to Russia proper. If you follow the Ukraine war on social media, you may have gotten used to the videos. Grainy, far-off recordings of oil refineries on fire or factories going up in flames. Images of slow-moving drones lazily dropping out of clear blue skies to go crashing into infrastructure. Evidence of Ukraine's long-distance sabotage campaign, these videos are often posted to demonstrate Kyiv's reach, to show Ukraine's ability to hit Moscow's assets hundreds of kilometers behind the front lines. What's less remarked on, though, are Moscow's own attempts at retaliation. By this, we don't mean the endless bombardments of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Rather, we mean a Kremlin-linked campaign of destruction being carried out beyond Ukraine's borders in nations all across Europe. A campaign that doesn't utilize drones or missiles, but small groups of radicalized locals often acting for little more than spare change. a campaign of sabotage targeting NATO members that appears to be growing in intensity. That, at least, is the assessment of multiple Western officials. The head of German domestic intelligence, for example, warned in April that, quote, "We assess the risk of Russian state-controlled acts of sabotage to be significantly increased." In Britain, the head of GCHQ has said the agency is becoming, quote, "increasingly concerned about growing links between the Russian intelligence services and proxy groups to conduct cyber attacks, as well as suspected physical surveillance and sabotage operations." Speaking off the record to outfits like The Economist and Bloomberg, other officials have concurred that Kremlin-backed operations in Europe are picking up steam, culminating in what a NATO statement described as, quote, "sabotage, acts of violence, cyber and electronic interference, disinformation campaigns, and other hybrid operations." Certainly, there's no shortage of examples to point to. In the last couple of months alone, people have been charged in Britain with setting fire to warehouses storing aid for Ukraine. A man has been arrested in Poland for spying on the key logistics hub of Rzeszów Airport, and 2 men in Germany have been accused of plotting attacks on US military facilities, all at the behest of Russia's GRU agency or Wagner Group. Further north, in Sweden, Chatham House reports that security services are now investigating recent train derailments as acts of sabotage. In Lithuania, an aide of Alexei Navalny was attacked with a hammer. And in Latvia, a dual Estonian-Russian citizen seems to have been paid to deface the nation's war memorials. So far, these attacks have been relatively small-time stuff, at least compared with previous Russian efforts. When the GRU bombed an arms depot in the Czech Republic in 2014, 2 people were killed. When they tried to assassinate a former Russian spy with nerve agent in England in 2018, a British woman ultimately wound up dying from exposure to the poison. To date, none of the new sabotage attacks have reached this level of destructiveness. Nonetheless, their increasing frequency and brazenness suggests that the Kremlin is starting to step up its shadow war with the West. This is especially true when combined with incidents taking place in other domains, such as cyber attacks. Back in April, Google's Mandiant cybersecurity division published a document suggesting hackers affiliated with the GRU had broken into and manipulated systems controlling water utilities or hydroelectric power plants in Poland, France, and even America. Meanwhile, Chatham House reports that Russian GPS signal jamming has become an increasing problem in Europe's north, not only because it knocks out some fail-safes on airplanes and renders certain airports unusable, but also because, as in the north of Norway, it can take down systems used by emergency services. As the think tank's report put it, economic costs and levels of disruption are high and increasing. In a similar vein, the Kremlin also seems to be jamming communications equipment used by shipping vessels. Although there's no suggestion it puts these ships in danger, it creates economic cost by forcing up insurance rates. Overall, then, the picture is one of a deliberate campaign being waged across Europe, one that sometimes manifests itself in mild irritations like flights being grounded, and other times in more sinister acts like warehouse fires and train derailments. The good news is that the GRU so far seems to be avoiding doing anything truly spectacular. According to the director of the European Centre for Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, Teija Tillakainen, the Kremlin seems to be trying to keep these operations at a low enough level to avoid retaliation. In her words, Russia is trying to get the most out of its power while still avoiding counter-reactions or immediate countermeasures. The bad news is that Tillakainen also thinks that the attacks we're seeing right now are Moscow testing out its tools, gathering data on what does and doesn't work prior to an actual conflict. This is also the position of Keir Giles, a military expert considered an authority on all matters Russia. In a recent article, Giles wrote about how he and other specialists had prepared a study for the Swedish Defense Research Agency in 2020, which looked at methods the Kremlin might use to paralyze Europe on the eve of a full-blown war. In his words, what is alarming now is that so many of the methods we described, including GPS jamming, sabotage, local proxies, and much more, are already in play across Europe and in the UK. Of course, the flip side is that Western spy agencies can gain valuable knowledge about possible Kremlin wartime plans by examining these current operations, which is why one of their most surprising aspects is now widely known: the use of locals. Earlier this month, Lithuania's intelligence services revealed that the GRU is actively trying to recruit citizens of the Baltic states to carry out low-level provocations. The methods used aren't particularly sophisticated. On social media platforms like Telegram, recruiters contact young men with criminal records who are looking to make a bit of cash and offer them money to do minor jobs. According to Bloomberg, these range from taking photographs of nearby military installations to vandalizing war memorials. In Estonia, a small group of youths were paid trivial amounts of money to smash up a government minister's car. Further up the scale, in terms of seriousness, are those recruited through extreme right networks to engage in violent activity. The Telegraph believes that GRU is cultivating ties with pro-Putin members of the British far right in the hopes of potentially using them to commit terror attacks. Farther to the east, those recruited are less likely to be far right and more likely to have grown up with sympathies towards the communist regime swept away at the end of the Cold War. On the borders with Ukraine, the threat is more serious still. Romania's Defense Council has warned that Russian spies may try to infiltrate the country posing as Ukrainian refugees. In short, it seems like the methods Russia is testing involve using local actors to carry out attacks and provocations and otherwise sow discord in ways that can be denied. And while those operations are currently below the threshold that might trigger a NATO response, they would be worryingly easy to scale up. Indeed, the Financial Times recently ran a report detailing how Europe's intelligence agencies believe the Kremlin might already be planning to take things up a gear. In their words, Russia has already begun to more proactively prepare covert bombings, arson attacks, and damage to infrastructure on European soil, directly and via proxies, with little apparent concern about causing civilian fatalities. While this sounds extreme, it actually fits quite well with Moscow's known pattern of behavior. Time and again in recent years, the Kremlin has pushed at the limits of what the West finds acceptable. When it encounters no pushback, it then tries pushing even further. According to Keir Giles, this is the major mistake Western countries are making regarding these current operations. Quoting again, hostile action from Russia is becoming gradually normalized because nobody is willing or able to deal with it. Elsewhere in the same piece, he writes, Western inaction means there are no consequences for Moscow. Still, even if NATO is being absurdly cautious about how it responds to these recent sabotage attempts, that doesn't mean the Kremlin will necessarily go for broke. Speaking to the Telegraph, director of the Mark intelligence think tank Mark Galeotti suggested Putin may be more cautious of a backlash than we imagine. In his assessment, quoting, even if Putin speaks of a war against the West, in reality, he doesn't want an open conflict. If that's true, then there may be a natural ceiling to how large these operations can get, a point at which even the madman in the Kremlin might hesitate, lest he accidentally trigger the NATO-Russia war that he secretly fears. Such a discovery would be a relief. For all the current attacks, maybe ever so slightly hampering the flow of aid to Ukraine, they are nothing compared to what a string of bombings, train derailments, and serious cyber attacks might do. Yet, even if these attacks never escalate beyond their current level, they remain troublesome, not least because we may have to live with them for a long time to come. As The Economist writes, Russia has morphed into a nihilistic and unpredictable foe of the liberal world order bent on disruption and sabotage. It is like North Korea or Iran on steroids. If that's the case, then the future may be filled with more operations like these, expensive and disruptive, never quite rising to the level that requires a response, but nonetheless an ongoing burden on Western intelligence agencies. Social media may rightly celebrate each video of a Ukrainian drone successfully striking a Russian oil refinery, but we shouldn't forget the dark flip side to these small victories, the potential each one brings for a Russian response on NATO territory. And now we turn to the small North African nation of Tunisia, where intense protests have broken out amid a wide-ranging crackdown on dissent. With targets ranging from lawyers to journalists to political activists, the crackdown is widely understood to be an attempt to either lengthen the tenure of Tunisia's president, a man named Kais Saied, or otherwise see him re-elected to a second term despite major opposition to his authority. Tunisia is one of those places that's always worth watching on the global stage, a place where even small signs of unrest tend to have repercussions far beyond Tunisia's own borders. Back in late 2010, it was Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution and its overthrow of former President Ben Ali in 2011 that sparked the broader regional upheavals of the Arab Spring. But while the Jasmine Revolution was initially heralded as a major success story, Tunisia's story has gotten far more convoluted in the aftermath. After political upheaval, assassinations, economic woes, and a threat from a local branch of the Islamic State, the 2019 election of President Kais Saied looks, in hindsight, like the beginning of the end. After coasting into office with a huge electoral majority, Saied has dismantled much of Tunisia's democratic structure, including in a self-coup in 2021 that saw him assume incredible levels of executive authority far outside the bounds of what Tunisia's political system outlines for him. Since then, he has consolidated immense power, basically taking over the legislature and the judiciary in order to claim power for himself. Since Saied really consolidated his power in 2021, his country is engaged in routine prosecutions and arrests against high-ranking ministers and political officials. While the country's democracy-minded lawyers and judges have fought back as best they're able, Saied has managed to secure the loyalty of high judicial officials in supporting what amounts to his unchecked authority. Powerless to fight back, Political engagement among the Tunisian public has been dropping starkly for years, and under Said's rule, the country's broader situation is getting worse. But this past week, Tunisia's political opposition made a last-ditch attempt to try and reinvigorate the country, calling on Sunday, May 12th, for a reformed political climate in their country. What they hope for includes an end to the tight restrictions on political press and freedom of speech and assembly, and the release of prominent opposition leaders and activists who are facing years of imprisonment. More than anything else, the opposition wants a vote as President Said draws close to the end of his first 5-year term. As of now, Tunisia has not set a date for new elections, raising legitimate fears that Said might just remain in office or otherwise call a snap vote for which there can be no meaningful organization among the political opposition, with no real window of time to find the right candidates. The spark that set Tunisia alight yet again came last Saturday, the 11th, when the Tunisian government attempted to assert its authority with a 1-2 punch. On that day, Tunisian police stormed the headquarters of the National Bar Association, arresting a prominent lawyer and a fierce critic of the president named Sonia Dahmani. In the days immediately prior, Dahmani had gone on television to describe the unpleasantness of life in Tunisia after the president had made a speech claiming there was a conspiracy trying to keep undocumented migrants from sub-Saharan Africa inside the country against the government's wishes. The headquarters would be stormed again 2 days later, and another lawyer with a similar track record, one Mahdi Zagrouba, would be taken away too. Zagrouba had prior in the day joined a gathering to protest Sonia Dahmani's incarceration, although the Tunisian Interior Ministry would allege that he had verbally and physically assaulted policemen, thus leading to his arrest. Also, over the weekend, 2 journalists were arrested for dissent, one because of social media posts and one because of commentary given over the radio. The wave of imprisonments led to mass protests in the Tunisian capital of Tunis, a relatively rare occurrence in the nation today. Leading the protests were the so-called National Salvation Front, a political organization founded about 2 years ago that has weathered intense scrutiny and legal challenges from the Tunisian government. Last month, the National Salvation Front announced that it would boycott the 2024 election because of a lack of legitimacy, but that hasn't stopped the organization from taking a place on the front lines of Tunisia's protest movement, decrying the failure of Said to maintain a free and fair democracy. In retaliation for the protests, Said took to the airwaves as expected, decrying the country's political opposition, particularly potential candidates, as traitors and claiming they attempt to seek refuge from his government abroad. One potential candidate is indeed considering a run conducted from France, owing to fears that he would be arrested upon a return to the country. He's got good reason to fear such an outcome. Another prominent potential candidate, Abir Moussi, has been imprisoned for months. After the most recent round of crackdowns, Tunisia's Bar Association has led the charge against President Said's continued overreaches, citing abuse of power by the president and emphasizing that action against lawyers violates the very right to legal defense. Abroad, the incident has captured the attention of the European Union, which has in the last week noted that it's keeping an eye on the arrests of members of civil society, but stopped short of condemning Said for now. The United States has lodged a similar complaint, calling out the inconsistencies between Tunisia's constitutional guarantees and the actions of its leaders. But they didn't go any further than that. Within the country, the results of the crackdown have been apparent almost immediately, as media organizations begin to signal to the Tunisian government that they've gotten the message on how they should be self-censoring in the future. Explained French political scientist Vincent Gaissa in conversation with France 24, quoting, "The authorities are increasingly targeting anyone who expresses anything even remotely ironic, critical, or independent of the regime. These actions aim to stifle any form of expression, even what is not necessarily perceived as oppositional or dissent from the outset." Tunisia's press did issue some criticism of the wave of arrests, quoting one headline, "Ben Ali didn't care, Kais Saied did." This implies that even the old dictator Tunisia once overthrew would not have committed these sorts of abuses. But in a broader sense, it appears unlikely that Tunisian media will be willing to sacrifice itself for the country, or that it could even push back against the populist anti-migrant wave of anger that has helped Said remain in office relatively unchallenged. Today's Tunisia is a place with few similarities to what it was at the height of the Arab Spring. A once hopeful nation, and even a global success story, is now marked by fear, repression, and signs that worse things are yet to come. And while the events of the last few days are certainly notable, the reason we chose to spotlight them is not because the situation there is likely to get any better anytime soon. In fact, it's just the opposite. Tunisia, despite its backsliding, is unlikely to be pushed toward change anytime soon. The United States has been urged for years to start re-examining its relationship with Tunisia, but has instead produced clean photo ops between Joe Biden and Kais Saied. The situation in Europe is similar, with the EU even going so far as to rely on Tunisia to help slow down rates of migration across the Mediterranean Sea. It's an autocratic nation on the fringes of the Sahara at a time when nations with similar features are actively being courted by Moscow, putting Sa'ed in a highly advantageous global position where, if he were to begin drawing heat from his Western backers, he could simply threaten to become the next nation that keeps order with help from the now reformed Wagner Group. And at home, while many individual Tunisians have all the will and enthusiasm in the world to see Sa'ed deposed from office, the broader reality is that the Tunisian working and middle classes have no real desire to force him out. Once a bastion of democratic high ideals and once a trendsetter in the Arab world, Tunisia has settled back into an older and more familiar rhythm, and it's unlikely to be shaken out of that rhythm anytime soon. Finally today, we turn to the Middle East nation of Jordan, where recent accusations suggest an Iranian plot to carry out acts of sabotage and undermine the Jordanian monarchy. In a Middle East rapidly spiraling into a larger and larger shadow war, Jordan's accusations are especially relevant, suggesting that a nation that had worked hard to remain somewhat neutral in the region has now had its side chosen for it. The incident in question came to light on Wednesday, May 15th, when Jordanian sources revealed to Western media that a suspected plot to smuggle weapons into the nation had been foiled. The weapons in question are alleged to have taken a circuitous route to enter the kingdom, presumably supplied at some point by Iran. They found their way to Syrian militias with loyalty to Iran, part of the nation's so-called Axis of Resistance, unifying anti-Israel, pro-Iran, predominantly Shia Muslim elements across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Palestine, and elsewhere. From the militias in Syria, the weapons were transferred to a Jordanian cell of the Muslim Brotherhood Association, a transnational Sunni Islamist organization that's designated as a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, and others, and has had a long and contentious relationship with the Jordanian government. The particular cell that took possession of these weapons is alleged to have ties to the Hamas organization in Palestine. The plot was sniffed out in late March of this year, when several Jordanian members of the Muslim Brotherhood cell, all of Palestinian descent, were arrested. Other details on the plot have been murky at best. Jordanian sources interviewed by Reuters on the issue have declined to specify the acts of sabotage that the cell was planning, explaining that that information could compromise ongoing investigative and military action if revealed too soon. Hamas has denied any connection to the event and has emphasized that it only has an interest in targeting Israel. And to be clear, it's entirely in line for member organizations within the Axis of Resistance to have plenty of affiliations with each other but remain unaware of each other's specific plans until they're played out. Sources within Jordan's Muslim Brotherhood have contradicted that claim, suggesting that now-dead Hamas leader Saleh al-Aruri may have recruited this particular cell directly, although the Muslim Brotherhood denies having known about the plot before the cell members were arrested. But what has been clearly established is that the cell's aligned objective was to destabilize the Jordanian monarchy at a moment when Jordan sits at a crossroads between its alliances with the United States and its shared borders with Israel, Syria, and Iraq, making it into a potential flashpoint or even a battleground and expanding hostilities between Israel and organizations swearing fealty to Iran. Now, as we dig into what this alleged plot means, we've got to start with the timing. According to these Jordanian sources, the Muslim Brotherhood cell that was dismantled in March of this year. That's before Israel's strike on a consular building in Damascus, killing high-ranking members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and incensing the Iranian regime. It's before the massive Iranian retaliation, one that saw over 150 drones and dozens upon dozens of ballistic missiles crashing down toward Israel, but where Jordan, when forced to choose a side, opted to shoot down Iranian aerial threats in defense of Israel. And it's before the drawdown between both nations that saw Iran return to its posture supporting resistance organizations abroad and Israel return to its war in Gaza. All that is to say, Jordan's revelations are not that Iran sought to carry out acts of retribution against Jordan after it came to Israel's defense. In fact, the allegations Jordan is making, if true, would help to explain just how the table was set across the Middle East before the chaos of April 2024 and why Jordan seemingly had zero qualms about rushing to Israel's defense. Per the results of Jordan's own investigations, Iran was already working to foment unrest there, taking a relationship that had seen the two nations working to align more closely before the Israel-Hamas conflict began and throwing that relationship clear out of the window. It's not unique for Jordan to get wrapped up in transnational plots, especially ones where Iran and its regional allies are involved. Per the same sources interviewed by Reuters about the dismantled cell of saboteurs, Jordan has become a hotspot for international weapon smuggling, usually trying to get those weapons from Iraq and Syria to the Israeli-occupied West Bank territory with which Jordan shares a long land border. In those operations, smugglers tend to leave the weapons they're transporting in pits called dead spots, mark their locations, and then send a team of smugglers from inside Jordan to pick them up and move them along. But while Jordan has previously been inclined to look the other way on such things, the implication that those weapons could now be used against the kingdom itself introduces a whole other layer of complexity. Now Jordan will need to come to grips with the reality that it may be targeted by organizations that already have the keys to the castle. And for Jordan, a nation that's long walked a very fine line between its ties with the West and its ties to other Middle Eastern nations, that's potentially a major problem. The majority of Jordan's population are of Palestinian origin or heritage, with most of them or their families having fled to Jordan after Israel was founded, and as such, a large proportion of Jordan's people harbor firm loyalties toward the Palestinian cause. At the same time, Jordan has recognized Israel for decades and is one of America's closest allies in the region. In peacetime, that's worked to Jordan's benefit. It serves as a stabilizing force and a critical liaison between regional powerhouses that are typically unwilling to engage each other directly. But with Israel waging a crushing counteroffensive against Hamas in the territory of Gaza, Jordanians have been far less accepting of the status quo and increasingly interested in seeing Jordan turn its back on Israel. After Jordan took part in the defense of Israeli airspace against Iran's direct attack, opponents of the Jordanian monarchy have led growing waves of condemnation denouncing Jordan's king and his government officials as traitors. So, with news of a potentially destabilizing plot now coming to the fore, and with the table set in Jordan's arms smuggling and political ecosystem to recruit and train similar cells in the future, there's a new wrinkle to the long shadow of war racking the Middle East. While we here at Warographics have been part of a chorus warning about the risk of escalation between a potential Israel-Hezbollah conflict in Lebanon, a confrontation with the nation of Syria, or potentially even a larger-scale war directly against Iran, it now appears that we may all have missed a wrinkle. With pressure rising inside Jordan, popular discontent at an all-time high, mutually adversarial nations on opposite sides of its border, and infiltrators laying the groundwork to take down a weakening monarchy, it might end up being Jordan that's most vulnerable of all. What a potential crisis in Jordan would mean for the entire Middle East, it's difficult to say for sure. But however that plays out, this certainly is not going to end well.